When her parents disappeared, the cows began to behave abnormally. In 1893, Wyoming, a young rancher's daughter named Sarah was forced to feed her cattle something horrifying human eyes. But it wasn't just a strange act of desperation. The cows were different. Their eyes weren't just eyes, they were human eyes, filled with unnatural intelligence. And with that change came something far worse. The cows weren't just animals anymore. They had unlocked a terrifying telepathic connection with Sarah's mind. As her parents mysteriously disappeared, the animals began to control her every thought, and soon Sarah realized she wasn't just feeding them. They were feeding off her. It was early morning when Sarah first noticed the silence. The usual sounds of the ranch, the creak of the barn door, the distant lowing of the cattle were gone. There was no rush of her father's boots against the porch or the sound of her mother humming softly in the kitchen. The air itself felt thick, almost suffocating, and Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. The house was empty. She walked through the rooms calling their names, but no answer came. Her parents had disappeared overnight, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling void. No sign of struggle, no trace of where they might have gone. It didn't make sense. They wouldn't have just left her. They wouldn't have just disappeared. Sarah's first instinct was to head to the barn, but something tugged at her. The ranch felt wrong, like something was watching her. The cattle were still photos of them standing silently in the early morning mist. But as she approached, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. Their eyes were trained on her, and for a moment, Sarah felt as though she were looking into human eyes that weren't just lifeless, empty, but full of an unsettling, unblinking awareness. She shook off the feeling and tried to focus on the task at hand. It had been her father's responsibility to care for the cattle, but now it was all on her. She couldn't afford to be afraid, not with the ranch depending on her. But the cows didn't stop watching her, and that feeling of being seen followed her wherever she went. As Sarah fed the cattle, she noticed one cow in particular standing a few feet apart from the rest. This one had its head tilted, its gaze locked firmly onto hers. The others were calm, but this one was different. Its eyes were too intelligent, too focused, and that strange sensation of being observed deepened. She took a deep breath, trying to shake off the unease. But the more she tried to ignore it, the more that cow's stare felt wrong. Its human-like eyes seemed to recognize her, almost as though it knew something she didn't. But what? She blinked rapidly, then moved closer to the barn door to shut it. Her pulse raced as a thought crossed her mind. What if something had happened to her parents? What if the cattle had somehow done something? Stop it, Sarah muttered to herself. Get a grip. This was just the stress of everything happening at once. They were probably out looking for something, or at least taking a break. But even as the thoughts swirled in her mind, the tension in the air didn't lift. The cows didn't move. They stood still, every single one of them, their eyes fixed on her. Her mother's voice echoed in her head, reminding her to keep her head clear in times of stress, but it didn't help. The longer Sarah stayed on the ranch, the more that watching became unbearable. No matter what she did, no matter how she tried to move past it, cattle kept their gaze fixed, and it felt like they were waiting for her to do something. That evening, Sarah tried to settle down in her parents' room, hoping to clear her head, but the silence pressed in around her. It wasn't just the stillness of the house, it was the ranch, the cattle, the very land. There was something alive in the air, and it wasn't the wind. It felt as though the earth itself were holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her. She stood up, her legs shaking, and moved to the window. From here, she could see the cattle grazing quietly. Nothing seemed out of place, but as her eyes scanned the herd, she saw it again. The same cow, the one that had been staring at her earlier, now stood apart from the rest. Only this time, its eyes weren't just watching, it was waiting for her. And as Sarah stared back, something strange happened. It wasn't just a look anymore. It was as though the cow was trying to communicate with her. Something in its gaze, something behind those human eyes, was calling to her. The moment felt wrong, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. Something tugged at the back of her mind, urging her to approach the herd, to get closer. But what was she supposed to do? What could she possibly do with that feeling gnawing at her from the inside? You're not losing it, she told herself. There's a reason for all of this. You just have to stay calm. Sarah reached for her father's journal. She needed answers, something to explain the strange behavior. The cattle hadn't always been like this. They were his pride and joy. He had worked tirelessly to breed and care for them. So why this sudden shift? What could have made them different? As she flipped through the worn pages, a chilling thought crossed her mind. Her father had always been fascinated with the intelligence of the cattle, almost obsessed with it. Had studied them, bred them and experimented with ways to increase their awareness. Was it possible that something in the herd had changed? What if her parents had done something to make them more than just animals? The thought struck her like a bolt of lightning, and her pulse quickened. What if the cattle had already been experimenting with something that could explain their strange behavior? But why now? What had caused the shift? And where had her parents gone? She pushed the journal away, feeling a new wave of panic rising in her chest. Something was happening on this ranch. Something dark and unknown. And no matter how hard she tried to convince herself otherwise, it wasn't just the cattle that had changed, but this was just the beginning of her nightmare. The next morning, the ranch felt even more suffocating. The air was thick with a strange tension that Sarah couldn't shake, no matter how hard she tried. The cows had been quieter than usual, still, almost unnaturally so. They stood in place, as though frozen, their eyes still trained on her as she moved through the barn. The silence was deafening. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. As Sarah made her way to the feeding troughs, a chill crept down her spine. The usual pattern of the cattle, a few grazing in one corner, others milling about, was gone. They were all lined up in a perfect unnatural row, their eyes unblinking, following her every move. And then it happened again. The same cow, the one that had been staring at her the night before, locked eyes with her from the far side of the barn. This time, its gaze felt more intense, more deliberate. The human-like eyes bore into her, as though knowing her every thought, her every fear. She froze. For a long, heart-stopping moment, the world seemed to narrow to just her and the cows. The low hum of the herd filled her ears, but it wasn't just sound. It was like a pulse, a vibration in her skull, resonating deep inside her mind. She stumbled back, unsure if she was imagining it or if something else was happening. But the connection wasn't just visual anymore. The cows weren't just looking at her, they were reaching into her. Her hand gripped the edge of the barn door as she tried to steady herself. This was impossible. She had to be imagining it, right? There was no way this was real. But then she heard it, the voice. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, but a thought that wasn't hers. Stay close. Stay with us. The words were sharp, clear, too clear. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, her blood running cold. That thought wasn't hers. That voice was in her head. She whipped around to find the herd staring at her as one, their collective gaze pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. She felt her breath catch in her throat. What do you want?" she whispered, half to herself, half to the animals. The question seemed absurd, but the idea of them wanting something from her suddenly felt very real. But there was no answer. The air was thick with something oppressive, as if the cattle were waiting for her to understand something, waiting for her to act. Her legs shook, and she stumbled out of the barn, trying to escape the suffocating atmosphere. But even as she stepped outside, the weight of their gaze stayed with her. The cows hadn't followed her, no. They were still there, just standing in the barn, watching, waiting. Sarah's mind raced. She couldn't stay here. She needed to get away, to break free of this invisible force pressing down on her. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she saw the same cow again, one with the human-like eyes. It wasn't just staring anymore. It was moving towards her, the same unnatural, synchronized movements as before. Every step it took was deliberate, calculated. Why is it always that one? She thought, her pulse quickening. But just as she turned to run, she heard it again in her mind. "Don't go. You belong here." The words were not a suggestion, they were a command. A chill ran through her as she felt the air grow colder, heavier. Her legs felt like they were made of lead, rooted to the spot as if the ground itself had reached up to hold her in place. And then, as if on cue, the rest of the herd began to move. Slowly, almost deliberately, they walked towards her. Every one of them, eyes fixed on her, their gaze impossibly intelligent and strangely calculating. They moved in perfect synchrony, like they were a single united entity. The same low hum that had filled her mind in the barn pulsed through the air, louder now, vibrating the very ground beneath her feet. She could hear them, feel them, in her head, pushing, pressing, demanding. They were no longer just cattle. They were something else entirely. Something alive, something sentient. Her heart raced. She couldn't stay here, she had to leave. But the cattle kept coming. Step by step, they closed the distance. It was as though the space between them and her had vanished, like the world had shrunk down to just her and them, as if they were pulling her into their reality, their world. She felt the pressure building around her skull. "Don't go. You belong with us." The panic set in. She couldn't breathe. She tried to move, to turn and run, but it was like the very air had thickened, holding her in place. The pressure in her mind was overwhelming. It felt as though her thoughts were no longer her own, as if the herd was inside her, crawling through her brain, tugging at the very essence of her being. Then, in the distance, Sarah saw the barn door swing open. A figure stood in the frame, her father. His face was pale, his eyes dark and empty, like they'd been drained of all light. He took a step towards her, his movements slow and stiff. What's happening? Her heart raced. She ran towards him, desperate for a sense of safety. "Father!" she cried, but her voice was barely a whisper. She grabbed his arm, but it was cold, stiff. As she looked into his eyes, something inside her twisted. Those were not her father's eyes. They were the same dark, human-like eyes of the cattle. "Join them," he said, his voice hollow as though he were speaking from far away. "Join them." The words repeated in her mind, pulling her closer to the edge of the barn. Before she could say another word, the herd moved again, stepping into the shadows with a fluidity that shouldn't have been possible for such large creatures. Sarah's vision blurred. Was her father gone? Was this some nightmare she couldn't wake up from? But the truth hit her with devastating clarity. The cattle weren't just watching her. They weren't just calling to her. They had taken her parents' hand now. They were coming for her. The last thought she had before everything went black was the overwhelming, crushing sense of inevitability. The cows were not done. When Sarah awoke, the world around her felt different. The ranch was eerily quiet, but something in the air had shifted. The usual tension that had hung over the place was now heavier, darker. Her body ached, and as she slowly sat up, she realized she was no longer in the barn. She was in her parents' bedroom, lying in the old creaky bed where her mother would comfort her after a long day. Her mind raced. What had happened? Had she passed out? Had she fallen asleep from exhaustion? She couldn't remember. Her heart pounded as her eyes scanned the room, but she saw nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, something was wrong. The air felt alive, humming with a strange energy that she couldn't place. The familiar comfort of the room was gone, replaced by an undercurrent of something else, and it wasn't just the air, it was in her head. She could hear it again, the faint hum that she had grown accustomed to over the last few days. It wasn't physical, but something inside her Mindan echo of the cattle's presence, their thoughts pressing against her own. And with it, the whispers began again. "You're one of us now." The words were soft at first, almost like a suggestion, but they weren't hers. They were theirs. She could hear them clearly in her head, just as she had in the barn. The same pressure against her mind, the same oppressive weight. It was getting harder to ignore, harder to distinguish between her own thoughts and the invasive ones that weren't hers at all. Her fingers trembled as she touched her forehead, trying to dispel the feeling, to clear the fog that clouded her thoughts. But it didn't work. The pressure was growing stronger, not weaker. Her heartbeat quickened as the whispers continued, their message unrelenting. "You belong to us." The words felt almost like a command, but Sarah pushed them aside. She had to remain in control. "This is my mind," she thought. "I won't let them win." But the more she fought, the louder the whispers became. It wasn't just the cattle anymore, they were becoming more than just animals. And their mind stones, human-like mind chad, somehow reached into her, burrowing into her very thoughts. The whispers turned into a hum, and the hum became a vibration, deep in her bones, rattling her insides. "Stay with us. You can't escape. You were chosen." The words tangled with her own thoughts, weaving their way into every corner of her consciousness. Sarah tried to get up, to do something, but her body refused to obey. It was as if something was holding her there, binding her to the bed, to the ranch, to them. The whispers swirled around her like a storm. "We are waiting. You will come." She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the words, but they only grew louder, more insistent. Sarah couldn't breathe. Her chest tightened as though the very air around her had thickened. The whispers weren't just thoughts anymore. They were emotions, desires, needs, commands. It wasn't just the cattle that were speaking to her. It was something else, a collective, a presence that went beyond anything she could understand. The cows had become something more, a force that stretched across the land, into her mind, into her soul. Suddenly the room grew colder. The whispers froze, then disappeared. It was as if a door had slammed shut in her mind, but the absence of sound was just as deafening. She gasped for air, feeling like she was suffocating. When she opened her eyes, she wasn't in her parents' bedroom anymore. The room had transformed. It was darker, colder unnaturally so. Shadows danced across the walls, moving with a life of their own. The air smelled thick with something earthy, like soil and decay. The cattle's presence surrounded her, and she could feel their gaze from all around the room, as though they were watching her from every direction. She stood up, but the ground beneath her feet felt strange, soft, like it was shifting. The walls seemed to pulse, throbbing with an unseen energy. She reached out, touching the wall, but it was warm. Warm in a way that didn't make sense, like something living. Her mind raced. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a result of the mental strain she had been under. She had to wake up, get out of here, but the more she tried to move, the more she felt tethered to this place. And then she saw it, a cow, the same one, the one with the human-like eyes, standing in the corner of the room. It wasn't alone. The rest of the herd was there, but they were different. Their eyes glowed now faintly, a sickly yellow-green that illuminated the shadows. Their forms weren't just shadows, they were alive, moving, breathing. The hum returned, but it wasn't just in her mind anymore. It was in the room, vibrating the very air. The cow with the human eyes stepped forward, its gaze never leaving Sarah. "You cannot fight us," the voice echoed in her mind, this time louder, sharper, more real. "You are ours." The ground beneath Sarah's feet seemed to shift again, and she stumbled, nearly falling. She tried to back away, but the room was closing in on her. She could feel the walls pressing against her, the weight of the herd's collective presence pushing down on her. There was nowhere to go. The cow stepped closer. "Join us. You have no choice." Her breath caught in her throat as the cow's face shifted, changing right before her eyes. The skin melted, pulling away to reveal something darker, more grotesque. Its features blurred, becoming a distorted mass of flesh, eyes still staring, but now without mercy. The hum grew louder, more intense, until Sarah felt like her skull would split from the pressure. "Join us." The whisper came from all directions now, from the walls, from the ground, from the very air around her. She couldn't escape it. She couldn't escape. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor, her mind filled with a cacophony of thoughts, no, commands. It was happening again. The cows had taken over. They were controlling her thoughts, taking her soul, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But in the very last moment, before everything went black, a single thought cut through the noise. It was hers, a cry of defiance. "I won't be one of you." The world around her cracked, splitting apart, and for a second, just a fleeting second, Sarah felt free. Then the darkness closed in. Sarah's eyes snapped open, but it wasn't the ranch she saw. It was darkness complete and suffocating. Her chest rose and fell with shallow breaths as she slowly became aware of her surroundings. She wasn't sure how long she had been unconscious, but the weight pressing on her chest, the lack of clarity, the stillness in the air told her this wasn't normal. It wasn't just the silence, it was the absence of life. She pushed herself up with trembling arms, her body feeling like it was made of stone. Her mind was foggy, each thought like trying to remember a dream that slips away as soon as you wake. As she steadied herself, the world around her began to take form, shadows, outlines of shapes, but nothing seemed solid. The air was thick with a cold, unnatural weight, as though the very space she inhabited was suffused with an eerie, alien presence. Her head spun as she tried to stand, and for a moment, she thought she might collapse again. But she needed answers. She needed to know where she was, what was happening to her. She wasn't on the ranch anymore, but she didn't know where else to turn. Her legs unsteadily carried her forward, and her eyes flickered across the strange, indistinct room. The walls seemed to sway, like they were moving just out of the corner of her vision, and there was something distinctly wrong about the floor beneath her feet. It didn't feel like wood or stone. It felt soft, alive. A sound, faint but unmistakable, broke the silence, a whisper, but it wasn't the low hum from before. No, this was more precise, more calculated. The voice seemed to come from all directions, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone, the rhythm, it was familiar, and then it hit her. It was the cows. Their presence was everywhere, now. She could feel them in her mind, pressing against her thoughts, like an invisible tide pushing up against the shore. But this wasn't just the eerie presence she had sensed before. No, this was more. The voice whispered again, and this time, the words were clearer. "Join us." The words echoed in her head, cold and demanding. She shook her head, desperately trying to push them out, but it didn't work. The voice demanded her attention, a force in and of itself, as though every cow that had ever existed was speaking through it. She clutched her head, pressing her palms against her ears as if that would block them out. But it didn't. It never worked. Then, the walls around her began to pulse, the shadows shifting in a way that made Sarah's heart race. She stepped back, terrified, but there was nowhere to go. The air seemed to close in, suffocating her. She needed to escape. She ran. Every step felt like running through molasses. The more she pushed forward, the more the shadows seemed to move, keeping pace with her, closing the distance. The whispers turned into an unrelenting hum, a drone that seemed to vibrate through her bones. She was not alone, they were everywhere, 1,000 eyes watching, 1,000 thoughts pressing in. And then, out of the darkness, she saw it, a figure moving toward her. At first, she thought it was a shadow, a trick of the light. But as it drew closer, she saw it clearly. The human-like eyes. It was one of them, one of the cows. But it wasn't just a cow. It was standing on 2 legs, its form elongated, distorted. Its body was covered in matted fur, but the face was unmistakable. Those eyes, those haunting, intelligent, human-like eyes. And there was something else, as something familiar. It was like looking at her father's face, her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't possible, but there it was, standing before her father's face, twisted and merged with the grotesque features of the cow. She took a step back, unable to process what she was seeing. The thing, it wasn't just one of the herd anymore. It was something else, something more. The figure's mouth opened and Sarah thought it might speak, but instead, it emitted a low, guttural sound like a breath, or something deeper, something unnatural. And then, the voice in her mind spoke again, this time clearer, stronger. "You can't escape. You belong to us now." The words chilled her to her very core. She wanted to scream, to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The connection was too strong. The figure with her father's face took another step toward her, and she could see the full extent of the transformation. Its eyes, still human but filled with an unnatural malice, locked onto hers. Its hands were enormous, twisted, with claws like those of an animal. Yet there was something human about the way it moved, too. "Join us." Sarah stumbled back, the pressure in her head unbearable now. She could feel the presence of the herd, their thoughts, their desire for her to join them. The force was pulling at her, her mind slipping further under their control. Her father's face stared at her from the creature's body, and it grinned. "You're becoming one of us," it said, its voice low and rasping, but unmistakable. It was her father's voice, twisted and distorted, but it was him. Sarah gasped, the truth hitting her like a slap to the face. Her father wasn't dead. He wasn't gone. He had been changed, transformed, taken over by whatever malevolent force had consumed the cattle. They had taken him, and now they wanted her. A wave of nausea hit her, and she dropped to her knees, unable to breathe. The creature before her stepped closer, its eyes never leaving hers. The pressure in her mind grew stronger, heavier. Sarah could feel herself slipping, her thoughts becoming muddled, her identity slowly being consumed by the collective. "Please," she whispered, but the words came out as a broken plea. "I don't want this." Her voice cracked with desperation, but the creature just grinned wider, and the voice in her head only grew louder. "You have no choice. You were chosen." The world around her spun, and the next thing she knew, the ground beneath her feet was gone. She was falling, plummeting into an abyss. The air was thick, and the pressure continued to grow as she spiraled downward. Everything around her felt like it was closing in, suffocating her. The last thing Sarah heard before the darkness swallowed her whole was the voice, cold and final, "You are ours." Sarah awoke again, but this time, there was no disorientation. She was fully aware of where she was, strapped in the suffocating grip of the ranch, her mind caught in the relentless tug of war between her thoughts and the telepathic force of the cattle. Her hands trembled, the chill in the air biting into her skin, but it was the pressure in her mind that she could no longer ignore. It felt as if her brain was being squeezed, pulled apart by invisible hands, twisting her thoughts into something unrecognizable. The barn loomed ahead, an imposing structure that now felt like a prison. As Sarah made her way toward it, the air thickened with an unnatural stillness. Every step felt heavier, as if the ground itself was conspiring against her. The cattle were in Sadesh, she could feel them, their presence pushing against her consciousness like an invisible wall. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The silence was deafening. The cows were lined up, just as they had been before, their eyes glowing with that same unnatural yellow. The room seemed to vibrate with the hum she had come to dread, the low, incessant drone that reverberated through her bones. The cattle, as always, stood perfectly still, their human-like eyes fixed on her. "Join us." The voice came unbidden, sharp and clear. Sarah's stomach lurched and she recoiled, her fingers digging into the wood of the barn door. She tried to block the thought, tried to fight it, but it was like pushing against a tidal wave. The pressure grew stronger, more insistent. "You belong with us. You can't fight it." The words seemed to seep into her skin, crawling beneath it, until she could feel the rhythm of the herd pulsing in her veins. Her heart began to race, her breath shallow, and her legs felt like lead. She was losing herself. The thoughts weren't hers, they couldn't be. And yet, they were inside her, twisting her sense of reality, weaving into every corner of her mind, making her question what was real and what wasn't. She closed her eyes, but the vision of the cattle didn't disappear. They were inside her, their thoughts becoming her own. Each cow, each presence was like a whisper in her head. She couldn't escape. The pressure tightened, like a vice around her skull, and she gasped, clutching her head as though it might explode. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I won't be one of you." But it was too late. The words, the thoughts weren't hers to control anymore. The cattle's influence was spreading like wildfire, consuming her mind, one thought at a time. They were in her. They had made her part of their collective. The horror of it, the horror of knowing that her own identity was slipping away, made her stomach churn. She could feel them feel their desires, their hunger. The cows were more than just animals. They had transcended that, and now they wanted her. They didn't need to speak. She could feel it in her bone-stir will, their need for her to join them. It wasn't just a request, it was an imperative. And with each passing second, Sarah felt herself slipping further, her will weakening as their influence expanded. She tried to move, to do something to shake free of their grip, but it was impossible. Her body wouldn't obey her. Her mind was no longer her own. She was then part of the collective, a single mind among many. "You belong to us. You are one of us." The thought hit her like a tidal wave. There was no escape, no way to fight it. She was becoming part of them, part of the herd. Her father's face flashed in her mind, twisted, distorted, yet somehow familiar. He was there, one of them, merged with the collective. His face had become one with the cattle, his mind part of theirs. And then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, Sarah understood. It wasn't just about control, it was about consumption. The cattle weren't just taking her thoughts, they were taking her soul. She was losing herself. Everything that made her Sarah, everything that made her human, was being replaced by the collective will of the herd. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the floor, her body shaking as the hum in her mind grew louder, more overwhelming. The cattle's presence filled every corner of her consciousness, pushing out everything else. "You belong to us. You are ours." She tried to scream, but the sound never left her throat. The words in her mind drowned it out, blocking her own voice. She couldn't even tell what was real anymore. She wasn't sure if she was still standing in the barn, or if the walls had disappeared entirely, or if the cattle had merged into one singular entity, the collective. They had taken everything from her, and now they wanted her to become one of them. "You are one of us." Her breath quickened, panic surging through her. This was it. This was the end. She was losing herself to them, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Her thoughts, her soul, her identity, all of it was being devoured piece by piece. But just as she felt herself slipping into oblivion, a strange sensation pierced through the fog of her mind. It wasn't the hum of the cattle. It wasn't their presence. It was something else. A voice. It was faint, weak, but it was her voice. "I won't let you win." It was a whisper, a defiant thought that pushed against the weight of the herd's influence. It was a spark of resistance, a flicker of her still remaining beneath the overwhelming pressure. The cattle didn't like it. The pressure in her mind intensified, and she could feel the collective trying to crush it, to snuff it out. But that spark refused to die. She refused to die. The voice in her mind grew stronger, her own voice, faint as it was fighting back against the collective. She clung to it, the last remnant of herself. She wasn't completely gone, not yet. Her hands clenched into fists, and with every ounce of strength she had left, Sarah fought. "I am me," she whispered, her voice hoarse but full of determination. "I will not be one of you." For the first time in days, the pressure in her head began to shift. The hum, the voices began to falter, to lose their grip on her mind. She felt the collective's influence weakening, felt the connection beginning to tear. The cow's grip loosened, and Sarah could breathe again, though her breath was shallow. Her vision cleared, and she realized she was still in the barn, still standing on shaky legs. The cattle were still there, but they were no longer watching her as they had before. They were fading, their forms flickering in and out of focus. She was still herself, for now, but as she took a shaky step back, Sarah knew one thing: this was only a temporary victory. The cows had not given up. They had just paused. They would come for her again, and next time they might not let her go, but she wouldn't go down without a fight. Sarah's mind was still reeling from the violent tug-of-war between her own consciousness and the overwhelming force of the cattle. She couldn't afford to lose herself again. Not now. The victory she had snatched from the herd was fragile like glass teetering on the edge of a cliff, ready to shatter with the slightest push. She had no illusions that she would be left in peace. The cattle were relentless, their hunger insatiable. She stumbled out of the barn, breathing in the cool, fresh air, trying to steady herself. The ranch was the same, but it no longer felt like home. It was a place of constant unease, a place where everything she knew had been turned upside down. It was like walking through a dream familiar, yet utterly foreign. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate as she made her way to the house. She couldn't stay out in the open for long. The cattle were still watching her, even from a distance. Their presence, though not as suffocating as it had been in the barn, still lingered in the air like an unseen storm on the horizon. Inside the house, the air was still and heavy. She could hear the creaking of the wooden floorboards beneath her feet as she moved through the familiar rooms. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. But Sarah wasn't there to find comfort. She was there to find answers. There had to be. Something. Some explanation for why her parents had disappeared and why the cattle had changed. The only way she would ever have any hope of surviving was to understand what had happened here on the ranch, in the fields, and in her own mind. Her eyes scanned the room, landing on the small study where her father had spent most of his time. The journals. She had to find the journals. Her father had always been meticulous in his research, writing down every thought, every experiment, every observation. He had been obsessed with the cattle, with their intelligence. He had believed they were more than just animals, that they were capable of much more. And now it seemed he had proven it. But at what cost? Sarah sat down at the desk, her hands trembling as she flipped through the papers that lay scattered in front of her. The words blurred together as she skimmed through them: behavioral studies, psychic potential, mental connection. She stopped on a page that caught her eye. The words were harshly scrawled, as though written in a moment of desperation. It's happening faster than expected. The cattle are no longer just animals, they are becoming something else. The connection is deepening. The boundary between them and us is fading. I fear what we've unlocked. The words made her stomach churn. Her father had known. He had known what was happening to the cattle, and yet he had continued, pushing further and further into something unnatural. It wasn't just an experiment, it was a curse. Sarah's breath quickened as she read on, her eyes scanning the hastily written notes. There were mentions of rituals, strange, forbidden practices. The cattle weren't just changing because of genetic manipulation. There had been something else, something ancient, something that had been buried beneath the ranch for generations. And now it had been awakened. She felt her head spin as the pieces of the puzzle clicked together. The ranch wasn't just a farm, it was a site, a place where forces beyond her comprehension had been sealed away, waiting for someone to unlock them. Her parents hadn't just been breeding cattle. They had been tampering with something far more dangerous, something that should have been left undisturbed. But Sarah wasn't ready for what came next. As she flipped to the last page, her eyes widened. The final note was not written by her father, it was a warning. If you're reading this, it means the ritual has failed. The cattle are no longer just cattle. They are vessels, and you have become part of their collective. You will not escape. The words were a chilling confirmation. The cattle were no longer just ordinary animals, they had become conduits for something far older, more powerful. Her father had failed to control them, and now the herd was acting on its own. The room around Sarah seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick with a suffocating weight. She could feel the presence of the cattle again, their minds brushing against hers, testing her. The connection was still there, stronger than ever. The more she tried to fight it, the more they pressed in. You are part of us. The whisper came in her mind, cold and insistent. The pressure was suffocating, drowning out her thoughts, making it harder to breathe. She stood up abruptly, her hands clutching the desk as she tried to steady herself. But then, something unexpected happened. A voice, real this time, broke through the mental barrage. Sarah. Her breath hitched as she turned toward the door. Her heart stopped. There, standing in the doorway, was her mother, or at least the form of her mother, but something was off. The woman before her had the same features, the same face, but her eyes were empty, hollow. The warmth that had once filled her mother's gaze was gone, replaced by something cold, lifeless. I told you, Sarah, her mother's voice rasped, the words coming out in a low, mechanical tone. You cannot escape. You belong to us now. Sarah took a step back, her mind racing. This couldn't be happening. Her mother had disappeared. She had been taken just like her father. But now it seemed she had returned not as a person, but as a vessel for the collective. No, Sarah whispered, shaking her head. No, you're not her. But the woman, her mother, stepped forward, her movements unnaturally slow, as though she was being guided by something else. Her eyes, those dead, hollow eyes, stared at Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. "You are her," the voice said again. "You are one of us." The realization hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. Her parents hadn't just disappeared. They had been consumed. They had been taken into the herd, their minds merged with the collective, and now she was being pulled in as well. The connection was growing stronger. The more she tried to fight it, the more it tried to consume her. It was too late to escape. The force had already taken hold. "You are ours, forever." Sarah collapsed to her knees, her mind breaking under the strain. There was no escape. The ranch, her parents, the cattle, they were all part of this cursed ancient force, and now she was too. As her vision blurred, she heard the final whisper in her mind. "Join us." Sarah could feel it, the pull, the way her body refused to obey her, like her own limbs were not hers to command. The pressure in her mind was unbearable. She had fought so hard, tried to maintain control, but the whispers of commands kept growing louder. The line between her thoughts and theirs had blurred beyond recognition. The cattle were no longer mere animals. They were something more, something she couldn't fully comprehend, yet something that had her in its grip. The ranch around her was no longer a place of familiarity. It was a trap, designed to break her down, to draw her closer, piece by piece, until she was nothing but a cog in the collective mind of the herd. The cattle, with their eerie, human-like eyes, were the agents of this force. They weren't just waiting for her to join them, they were actively pulling her into their world, into their mind, and every passing second made it harder to resist. The room around her seemed to close in, the walls closing tighter and tighter. Sarah struggled to breathe, the very air thick with an almost suffocating pressure. It wasn't just the cattle's influence, there was something else, something much darker at play. This wasn't just about the animal's control over the thoughts, it was about her soul, her identity, being devoured by the collective consciousness. They wanted to consume her, they wanted her to become one of them. "You belong with us." Their voice pushed into her mind again. It was the same, cold and insistent, but this time there was something new, intensity. The tone was no longer a gentle whisper, it was forceful, unyielding. It was like they were taking control of her very will, forcing her to obey. Sarah's legs gave way, and she collapsed to the floor. The cold earth beneath her felt too real, too solid, and yet it was the only thing that anchored her in the world she still recognized. She clenched her fists, trying to focus, trying to fight the suffocating wave of psychic energy that was crashing over her. The collective mind, the herd, it was inside her, part of her now. She could feel their thoughts, their desires, their collective will pushing at the boundaries of her mind, seeking to break through and overwhelm her. But as much as they pressed, she refused to yield. She couldn't give in. She wouldn't. "No," she whispered through gritted teeth. "I am not one of you. I am Sarah. I am me." The pressure in her skull intensified, and for a moment she thought her head might explode. She gasped for air, the pain inside her growing worse by the second. The collective's presence swarmed around her, seeping into her thoughts, twisting everything she believed to be true. But through the pain, there was a flicker of clarity. She knew what they wanted. They had been clear about that from the beginning. They weren't simply controlling her thoughts, they were molding her. They wanted to consume her, to break down her identity, to absorb her into their collective mind. It was like a virus, slowly spreading, replacing everything that made her who she was. Her emotions, her memories, her will, it was all being consumed by their endless hunger. The cows wanted her to join them, to become part of the herd, part of the collective mind. But they weren't content to simply control her. No, their plan was bigger than that. They needed her, not just as a participant in their mind, but as a vessel. She was to be a conduit, the final piece in their twisted puzzle. She wasn't just supposed to think like them. She was supposed to become them. And that realization hit her like a slap in the face. They had no intention of allowing her to remain Sarah. They wanted her to lose herself entirely, to be consumed by them, to have no identity other than the collective. She would be no more than a puppet, no more than an extension of their collective will, their thoughts, their desires. The thought of it made her stomach churn. She couldn't allow that to happen. But there was no time to think. The moment of clarity was fleeting. The cows, those agents of the collective mind, began to move. One by one, they stepped forward. It was the same cow, the one that had been at the center of it all. Its eyes, those dark, human-like eyes, locked onto hers. It was watching her, studying her, waiting for her to give in. "Join us," The thought echoed in her mind again, more powerful than before, as if it were coming from every corner of the room. The pressure increased and her head felt as though it would explode. She could feel the collective mind surrounding her, pushing in on all sides. The urge to surrender, to give in, was overwhelming. She could feel their thoughts wrapping around her like chains, trying to drag her down into the darkness. But Sarah fought. She fought harder than she had ever fought before. She clenched her fists tighter, trying to hold on to whatever was left of herself. I am Sarah. She thought it over and over, willing it to be true. I am me. But then came the worst part, the part that twisted her insides into knots. The herd didn't just want her mind. They wanted her soul. They wanted to erase her, to take everything that made her, and make her part of their collective. They weren't just after control. They were after destruction, the destruction of her, of who she was. The same cow stepped closer, its gaze unwavering, its eyes burning with an unholy intensity. It was no longer just a mindless creature, it was a force, an agent of something older, darker, and it wasn't alone. The rest of the herd had gathered, surrounding her, pressing in, their minds linking together as one. Join us. But then, a voice, not one of the cows, but her own, rang out, clear and strong. I won't. The declaration was so simple, so pure, that it cut through the mental storm like a knife. And for the briefest moment, the pressure in her mind paused. The collective hesitated, just long enough for Sarah to take a breath. The cows, once united in their singular purpose, began to falter. The mental connection began to crack, splintering like glass. It was as if the collective was not as invincible as it had seemed. The link was still there, still strong, but something had shifted. Sarah was still fighting. She was still resisting. She wasn't done yet. The cow at the front took a step back, as though surprised by her resistance. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she stared at it. She wasn't sure how long she could keep this up, but she had to keep fighting. She had to. If she gave in now, there would be no going back. Join us. The voice came again, but it was weaker, less certain. Sarah took a shaky step forward, locking eyes with the cow. I will never be one of you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But it was her voice, her defiance, and it was enough to cause a ripple in the collective. The pressure around her began to lessen, just a little. It was enough. She had broken the hold, if only for a moment. But she knew this wasn't over. The cattle wouldn't stop. They would come for her again, harder, stronger, more desperate. But Sarah wasn't about to let them take her. She wasn't going to give up, not now, not when she still had a part of herself left. She could feel them in her mind, feel their desire to consume her, but she also felt something else, a flicker of hope. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah dared to believe that she might still have a chance. The air felt different now. Sarah could feel the weight of her resistance against the overwhelming psychic force of the herd. And yet, she knew that she had only delayed the inevitable. The cattle were no longer just passive observers. They were closing in, their collective will stronger than ever. Her defiance, her fight, had triggered something more dangerous than she could have imagined. As she stood, shaking, in the center of the barn, Sarah could hear the familiar hum of the cattle's collective mind beginning to resurface. It wasn't the soft whisper she had heard in the past. No, this time it was louder, more urgent. The sound vibrated through her skull, and her knees buckled beneath the pressure. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the sound, but it was impossible. The force inside her mind was too powerful now, too inescapable. You cannot fight us. You will not win. The words came like daggers, piercing through every thought she had left. In that moment, Sarah knew what she had to do. The herd was relentless, but it wasn't just them she was fighting now. It was the land itself. The ranch had become the focal point, the source of the cattle's transformation, and it was the one thing holding her back from escaping. The connection to the collective was tied to the land, to the ranch, to the curse her parents had inadvertently unleashed. Her mind raced, trying to piece together the fragments of the truth she had uncovered. She had read the journal her father's research. He had believed he could control the cattle, but the truth was darker. The ranch itself had been built on a land that held secrets, buried for generations. It wasn't just an experiment gone wrong, it was an ancient power that had been awoken, and it was now seeking to claim her. Sarah could feel the cattle pressing in around her, their minds brushing against hers, urging her to surrender. She could feel the weight of their collective thoughts pushing against her skull, trying to break her resolve. But she had come too far to give up now. The pressure in her mind reached a boiling point. The cow's thoughts became one continuous wave of demands, emotions, and hunger. The words became a chant, join us, join us, join us. Her body trembled with the effort to resist, but she knew she had to act. She couldn't let herself be consumed. She turned toward the barn doors, struggling to steady herself. With a surge of willpower, she pushed them open, and the sunlight poured in. But it wasn't the sun she was focused on, it was the fire. The ranch was the source of the curse, the source of the cattle's transformation, and it was the one thing she could destroy. The fire would sever the link, burn away the influence that the cattle held over her, and destroy the ranch once and for all. Her eyes scanned the ground as she reached for the nearest match. Her hands were shaking violently, but there was no turning back now. She had no choice. If she didn't destroy the ranch, she would never be free. The cattle would consume her, just as they had consumed her parents. Her heart raced as she struck the match. The small flame flickered to life, and she watched it for a moment, mesmerized by its tiny, fragile glow. This is it, she thought. This is how I fight back. She dropped the match to the dry hay beneath her feet, and the flame quickly spread, crawling along the floor like a living thing. Sarah stumbled back, watching as the flames grew higher, licking the walls of the barn. She could hear the crackle of the fire, the roar as it consumed the old wood, and for a brief moment, it felt like the entire ranch was trembling under the weight of its destruction. But as the fire spread, something changed. The cattle, once still and distant, began to move. Their eyes, those human-like eyes, turned toward the fire, and Sarah could feel the collective mind shift, its attention turning to the flames. She knew it wasn't just the ranch they were trying to protect, it was the connection. The power that held them to her, that held her to them. You cannot destroy us. The voice came like a thunderclap in her mind, deafening in its intensity. The cattle were fighting back, and with their collective will, they were pushing against her, trying to extinguish the fire before it could spread. The pressure inside her head grew exponentially, and Sarah's vision blurred. She could feel herself slipping, her thoughts merging with theirs, her body no longer her own. But she didn't stop. The fire was spreading, consuming everything. The heat was unbearable, but it was the only thing that could sever the connection between her and the cattle. If she didn't destroy this place, she would be lost forever. Her mind, her soul would be swallowed by the collective. "We are your family now." The voice was clear, insistent, but Sarah was beyond reasoning. The fire was her last chance. She staggered back, her legs weak beneath her as she struggled to keep moving, to keep pushing forward. But the fire was no longer just in the barn. The land itself was burning. The earth beneath her feet was shaking, as if the land itself was fighting back against the destruction. And then, as Sarah collapsed to her knees, the ground split open. It happened in an instant. One moment, she was standing, the flames licking at her skin, and the next, the earth beneath her cracked open like a giant mouth, swallowing everything in its path. The fire spread to the cracks, and as the flames ignited the land itself, the connection to the cattle, the collective mind began to fracture. The pressure in Sarah's mind started to ease, just as the ground beneath her gave way. The fire consumed everything. The cattle, the ranch, the land, they were all consumed by the flames. The earth trembled as the fire roared higher, and Sarah's vision went black. For a moment, she felt nothing, no pressure, no thoughts, no voices. There was only the sound of the fire roaring in the distance. And then, with a final burst of energy, the fire snuffed out, and everything went silent. Sarah's eyes fluttered open, but the world around her was still black. Her senses were overloaded, the sound of her rapid breaths deafening in the silence. The pressure in her chest felt suffocating. She could hear nothing but the ringing in her ears, but the overwhelming absence of the cattle their influence had left her dizzy. For a fleeting moment, she thought she might be dreaming. The fire, the destruction, it couldn't have been real, could it? But then, the weight of her limbs returned to her, and she realized she was lying on the ground. Her hands dug into the earth, and she pulled herself up shakily until she was on her knees. The ground beneath her was cold, unnaturally cold, and there was an odd quiet in the air that made her skin prickle. The fire was gone. The barn was gone. Everything was gone. Her heart raced as she looked around, blinking against the disorienting emptiness. There were no cows, no barn, no land. It was as though the ranch had disappeared entirely, leaving nothing behind but a vast, endless void. Sarah scrambled to her feet, her legs unsteady, but the air felt strangely empty. There were no animals, no whispers. The oppressive weight of the herd's collective mind was gone, and for the first time in days, Sarah could breathe without the suffocating pressure that had once filled her skull. She took a step forward, unsure of where to go, unsure of what she was supposed to do now. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Everything was gone. The fire, the cattle, the connection of it was gone. The ranch had burned to the ground. The earth had swallowed it whole. And yet, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't over. The quiet around her felt unnatural, like something was waiting just out of sight, something that hadn't been destroyed. Her chest tightened as the thought took root. The ranch may have burned, but the cattle weren't gone. Not entirely. Suddenly the air shifted. A whisper. It was faint but unmistakable. She froze. "We will return." The voice, though quiet, rang in her mind like an explosion. She gasped and staggered back, almost falling, as the words echoed through her consciousness. It was a voice she recognized, a tone that she had heard countless times before. The collective mind, the herd. It wasn't gone. It hadn't been destroyed by the fire. It was still there, waiting for its chance to return. And it had found a way into her mind once more. She gritted her teeth, trying to push the thought away, but it was no use. The connection wasn't severed. It had merely been hidden, buried beneath the rubble of the ranch. They were still there, still lurking in the corners of her thoughts. Her heart pounded in her chest as the dark realization settled over her. She could feel them cattle, their presence filling every corner of her mind once more. They were waiting for her, watching her, patient, persistent. Their hunger hadn't waned. They had merely retreated into the shadows, biding their time. Sarah's breath quickened as she fought against the rising panic. The fire had not been enough. The land had been destroyed, but the collective had somehow survived. There was no escaping it, no running, no hiding. "We will return," the words repeated, a cold whisper that slid into her thoughts like ice. Desperation clawed at her. She tried to focus, tried to calm her racing heart. She needed to think. "They've been toying with me this entire time." The cattle, the force controlling them. It wasn't just about taking her mind. It was about consuming her. The ranch had been their breeding ground, the site of an ancient power. And now that power had grown too strong to destroy with fire alone. The ranch had been more than just a home for cattle. It had been the source of the cattle's transformation, the source of their connection. And now that power was inside her. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, the whispers, but they continued to seep into her mind, flooding every corner of her consciousness. The collective had already claimed so much of her. Her memories, her identity were slipping away, piece by piece, replaced by the will of the herd. The cows weren't just trying to control her anymore, they wanted to be her. They wanted to erase everything that made her Sarah and make her part of their hive mind. She opened her eyes and looked around, desperate to make sense of her surroundings. The land beneath her feet still felt wrong, like the earth itself was shifting, warping beneath her. The silence was oppressive, as though the very air had changed. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, a shape in the distance, emerging from the mist that seemed to hang in the air. At first, Sarah thought it might be a hallucination, a trick of the mind, but the closer it came, the more real it became. The figure was tall, looming, its form distorted, like something half-formed. And then she saw its eyes, the same eyes, the human-like, knowing eyes of the cattle. It wasn't one of them, but it was them. The figure was a reflection of the herd, a manifestation of the collective mind that had invaded her thoughts. It wasn't her father, it wasn't her mother, it was the herd itself coming for her. The figure's mouth opened, and the voice came again, this time, not in her mind, but in the air itself. "You cannot escape." It was a voice. That was both her own and not her own. A reflection of the collective mind that had taken her parents, that had tried to consume her. The figure took another step toward her, its eyes glowing with the same unearthly intensity as the cattle. Sarah's heart raced. There was nowhere to run. The herd was coming, the figure was coming, and it was bringing the collective with it. Suddenly she heard it again, the whisper, loud and clear, "We will return." But Sarah wasn't going to wait for them. He wouldn't let herself be taken again. Her mind was hers, her body was hers. She wasn't going to surrender. With one final defiant cry, Sarah turned and ran, not knowing where she was going, only that she could not stay here. She could not let the collective win. Sarah's feet pounded against the uneven earth as she sprinted through the darkened landscape. The figure, the manifestation of the herd, was still behind her, its eyes glowing with that unnatural, penetrating gaze. But she couldn't look back. She couldn't afford to. Every second, every step, was a battle to maintain control of her mind. Her head throbbed, the pressure of their influence still pushing at the corners of her consciousness. "We will return." The whisper was there, always, echoing through her skull, a reminder that the herd wasn't gone out completely. but Sarah couldn't let herself dwell on it. The earth beneath her feet felt wrong, like it was shifting, warping, but she pushed through the disorienting sensations. She needed to escape. She had to get away from this place. Then, in the distance, she saw it. A crack in the earth, a deep crevice, like a wound in the land itself. The ground had split, and a dark, pulsing energy poured from it, rising up like smoke. It was the power of the wrench to dark force that had corrupted everything it touched. It had to be destroyed. Sarah reached the edge of the fissure, feeling the heat radiating from it, the power of it pulling her in. But as she stepped closer, the figure behind her spoke again. This time its voice was stronger. "You cannot escape us." The ground trembled beneath her feet. The cattle, the collective force, they were here, and they weren't leaving. But she wasn't afraid. Sarah knew what she had to do. The land was the source, the conduit for everything. If she destroyed it, if she severed the connection between herself and the herd, maybe she could finally escape. She took one last, deep breath, and without hesitation, leaped into the fissure. The moment she did, a violent surge of energy exploded, sending shockwaves through the air. The ground shook as though the entire earth itself was screaming in agony. The force of the explosion was too much. Sarah felt herself falling deeper into the abyss. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the figure, reaching out toward her, its eyes glowing with that same unholy light. And then, silence. Final payoff when Sarah opened her eyes. The world around her was quiet, deadly quiet. The earth had swallowed the fissure, the dark power dissipating as if it had never existed. She was back on solid ground, but it was no longer the ranch. It was just land empty, silent, and still. The influence was gone. The pressure in her mind, the oppressive weight of the herd's presence, it was all gone. There was no whispering, no pull toward the collective. It was as though the very air had changed, freed from the dark power that had held her captive. But as Sarah stood there, the haunting words echoed in the back of her mind one last time, "We will return." Her heart skipped. The voice was faint, like a memory trying to break through. Was she truly free, or had she simply won a battle in a war that would never end?